Joining me now to discuss this is Tom Sharp, former Royal Navy commander. Tom, thank you for joining us here on Talk TV. Before we get into the woke crisis, apparently, that we're seeing in the military, do you have any idea why Queen Elizabeth, our aircraft carrier, was unable to leave port this weekend, despite hundreds, if not thousands, of people going down to see it? This seems that the entire fleet of aircraft carriers seems to be having similar issues when it comes to being deployed. What exactly is going on?
Yeah, there's definitely an issue with the propulsion train in both our aircraft carriers. They've both shown fragility now at key points. Prince of Wales last year, when a shaft alignment issue caused a coupling to break, that was very serious, needed docking to fix. And now HMS Queen Elizabeth, actually in the same place, a slightly different problem, it's corrosion, but the net result is the same. One day you're the centre of a national debate as to whether you should be assisting a NATO exercise or an operation in the Red Sea. The next day you're limping off to Rosyth to go into a docking period. So there is an unfortunate issue with the power propulsion train in our aircraft carriers. Prince of Wales, who was then obviously stepped in to take the load off Queen Elizabeth, will do so today. Rather unfortunate communications that suggested she would sail yesterday. In fact, there was a sailing window that started yesterday and finishes tomorrow. That's become quite common with our carriers now because of the complexity of them. And the plan is for her to sail today. So the very latest report I have is that there's no major problems with her. In fact, the turnaround, she was at 30 days notice to sail and she's managed it in 7. That's pretty commendable.
That's fantastic, and all our viewers will be really reassured to hear that there are no issues, apparently, with the Prince of Wales. But, you know, do you have a bit of a feeling that there seems to be, in a very dangerous world, a sort of blizzard of negative publicity and briefing around our armed forces? It seems to me there has been, just from reading the papers. And what do you think is driving it?
Well, certainly the carriers seem to be a magnet for unfavourable headlines, and it's fairly obvious why. They cost a lot of money. They take a decent percentage of the defence budget, and there are plenty within defence who would rather we didn't have them, as if that money would magically be spent on something else. So the carriers certainly attract negative headlines. Right now, there is a broader flurry of negative headlines, and I just think it's a function of the pre-war phase that allegedly we're in. Not attracting any more resources. Of course, it's not just a question of spending more on defence. You need to spend it better, and we need more people. I'm sure we'll come back to that in a second. But there is a disconnect between forces tasking right now, the amount they're being pushed out of the door to go and do key tasks around the world, and yet the lack of any sense of increased resources to meet those demands. And I think it's coming to a head. And I think as we get into the sort of pre-election campaigning phase, it's these things come up as something to talk about, as a topic of discussion.
But Tom, do you think it might be something to do with the change of Defence Secretary? Ben Wallace, very good friend of mine, former Scots Guard, former captain in the Scots Guard. We never heard anything like this from him, but the new Defence Secretary, Grant Shapps, has sort of gone out on the offensive to describe lots of the things that are going on in our armed forces as woke, and said that he's going to drive it out. Is this just a differing of style between the two of them? And do you think one approach is better than the other?
I think he's just appealing to certain sections of his party prior to the election and flushing out things that, if they exist, and I'll just come back to that in a second, but if they exist, were definitely embedded before his time. So there's always a sense that he can air that stuff and say, well, it didn't happen under my watch. The woke debate's fascinating, and I think.
Well, Tom, just before we get onto the woke debate, really interesting though, because I've been in Parliament since 2010, and it's always felt to me, whoever's been the Defence Secretary, we've had lots of them, that it's almost a sort of beyond politics brief, actually, that it's about keeping our country safe. It's about the key job of the government, protect your own people. Do you think this is something new, this very political stance that Grant Shapps almost sort of politicising the military in a way that we haven't seen before? Do you think that's what's going on?
It could be. I mean, security and prosperity, the two pillars of any government, and the security bit has been on the wane since the end of the Cold War. In fact, since the end of the Second World War, you can see the graph. The expenditure has been steadily declining for decades now, and we're very good in the military at making do, perhaps too good, you could argue. So there is at some point, as that graph attenuates to zero, it has to be reversed. You can't, otherwise you end up with no people and no equipment and no ability to fight, no ability to enact the political will of the time. And there's just an impending sense, I think, that we're getting to that inflection point. We're getting to the point where the financial graph is now so low, something has to be done. And I would argue that previous defense secretaries perhaps haven't energized in number 11 and number 10 enough to really reverse that. You get sticking plasters and you get strategic papers, but nothing has really reversed that gradual degradation of defense spending to zero. And it's very possible that he's just shaking that now because it's sensible pre-election and also needs to be done.
Tom, fascinating. What do you think the woke crusade that he's on in the armed forces will achieve, and how rife do you think the culture of woke is within our armed forces?
It's one of these subjects I'm pretty certain doesn't apply to 90% of the people 90% of the time. They're just going about doing their business. Ordinary people being asked to do extraordinary stuff, trying to get paid, trying to be efficient, trying to go home. You know, it's one of these things that it spikes periodically, and when it does, it attracts an awful lot of attention because it brings out some of the really nasty debates online. I think a bunch of senior officers writing in to moan about it perhaps doesn't present particularly well. And you have to remember that, and I count myself in this, not necessarily as a senior officer, but as a retired officer, we are the opposite of the target audience here. It doesn't really matter what we think about the woke culture. It really matters what the people who are wanting to join and the people who have just joined think. That's far more important, in my view, than senior officers shaking their fist at a problem that I think a lot of the time is perhaps exaggerated.
Tom, thank you so much for joining us here on TalkTV. How fascinating.